only imagine what it will be like when I walk by your side. I can only imagine what my eyes will see when your face is before. All right, I'll tell y'all what. Why don't you everybody scoot forward? Everybody scoot forward.
Scoot on up. That way we can talk to one another like we know each other. Yeah, Mike, you went right in front of the class, buddy. Then this is the class for you. I like Mike a whole lot. Okay. Good morning. How's everybody? Good. It's good to be back. It's good to see everybody. Do we have any prayer requests before we start today? Hey, Ryan, you need to go ahead and go downstairs, bud. Ryan, go ahead and go downstairs. Does anybody have any prayer requests? I'd like y'all remember Mackenzie, and I believe her last name's Meek. She was our waitress at Billy Ray's the other day, and the day after we had her, she was in a really bad car accident. She's in critical condition, but she's stable at the moment, so just remember her and her kids. Can you remember Jonah? Absolutely. Yeah. Anybody else this morning? I think she's recovering. She still has to stay home and rest, but I believe she's recovering. She's watching online, I believe. So, told me I can't talk about her today. So, it's never stopped me before, but okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Any prayer requests? Any unspoken? All right, Samuel, you offer up a word of prayer to start today.
Lord, thank you for allowing us to attend this church and this class this morning. Please open up our hearts and minds and allow us to understand you more and be able to learn to disciple to people that don't know you and bring them to you and help them bring others to you. So it's just a chain reaction. Lord, please be with Ben and help him with his message today. Please bless us all.
Amen. All right, so we're on week 6, correct? Okay. So a quick reflection of week 5, because we're talking about this process of discipleship. Now, what does it mean to be an intentional leader to you all? If someone's an intentional leader, what does that make you think of?
Someone that wants to be a leader.
Someone that wants to be a leader? Okay. What else?
Does all the little things okay needs to be done. He prepares, he looks ahead, he tries to anticipate. It's all those little things, okay, that are necessary to really, okay, give people to see, okay, God, what we're thinking.
Because they focused on little things. Now, according to your book, an intentional leader is someone who imitates who? Jesus, because we need to make sure we understand what the difference between an intentional leader secularly versus an intentional leader within the church. Because an intentional leader within the church is going to try to reflect Christ to those that he's leading. And one thing that really stood out to me in this was day 2. So if you turn back to page 80, we're just going to review this real quick and then jump into week 6. It says intentional leaders understand the game, and I think this is probably one of the most underly focused on areas when it comes to leadership within the church, is that most of us really, as leaders, really have no idea what our church members have to offer. Like we understand the game. We need to make sure we're understanding the spiritual side of things, and that's something that we really saw in Peru. I think a lot of times we don't really pay much attention to spiritual warfare in the United States because we are such an advanced country, and we have pretty much everything we need. And so we don't really think about the attacks of the devil too much. But if we understand the game, if you're looking at any sporting event, at any coach, what are they going to do before the game starts with their team? To prepare. What are they going to do? Practice, okay, but just because they're practicing, they're going to do the same practice, but they're going to have a different opponent every week. So what are they going to do to get ready for each opponent? They're going to scout them, okay? Now, what are the things they're looking for when they're scouting their opponents? Strength and weaknesses. I remember that was the first time I'd ever seen this when I was in high school, and our coach would write up on the board for basketball. He'd write up every starting player for the other team, their name, their height, their strengths, and he'd give their supporting cast and what they would do and how we were to guard, who was going to guard each person, and this whole thing. And I thought, man, that's a lot of work. But I always felt prepared when we played a team because he had given us this understanding. And I think in the same way, we have to make sure we understand, one, what is Satan trying to do? You know, two, we have to understand our weaknesses and our strengths. And we have to understand the game to be able to do that. So keep that in mind as we go, and I'm going to talk again more about that today in the sermon, about this spiritual side of things, that we really need to pay attention to the things that are going on around us. And we also need to know what our strengths are and what we can do as a team in order to advance the gospel. All right, let's go on to week 6. Starts at page 93, okay? I don't know if has anybody read ahead? No? Okay. Did you read ahead? No, it's sitting. It's still sitting beside my bed, isn't it? That's right. You're in good company. Sammy said he was too. All right, and I think this is probably the hardest part, and this is going to step on your toes as you read this week, because I think there's a lot of us that are social people, but we're not relational people, and there's a big difference. We like to be around people, but we don't want people in our lives, because that's too personal. We don't want them to know about the ugly side of things. So when we're looking at this, one thing that pointed out to me in the first two paragraphs, is you look at the second paragraph where it says real relationships are an essential part of God's plan. That next line, the world's need for relationships is God's opportunity to build disciples. This is what's kind of this, double-edged side of things, is that we desire relationship. We desire this intimacy amongst people, but yet at the same time we're reluctant to give it because we've either been jaded in the past, or we're afraid that people are going to know about our insecurities or our failures or our shortcomings, and then they're not going to want us. And so it's just this double-edged thing. But that desire right there is exactly the opening we need to make disciples. It's exactly the opening we need, because the one thing that I've heard, even since we came to this church, was how loving and open and inviting the people were in this church to be a part of our lives. And I've heard that from multiple people as they've come into the church, is how loving it is. But it's got to go a little deeper than that. So we're going to go to the first part, the small group priority. Somebody read for me on the right there, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. Somebody read that for me.
Be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. The things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others.
Be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others. All this is plural. All this is plural is when it comes to the people that are involved in this, okay? Paul is obviously giving Timothy direction about the men he's going to disciple, and the men they're going to disciple, and the people they're going to disciple, this group reciprocal discipleship process. And so I want to ask you to look at number 1 there, okay? What are 2 benefits of growing in a group instead of in isolation? I want you to turn to somebody around you, and I want you to discuss this. At least come up with one, okay? What are 2 benefits of growing in a group instead of in isolation? Okay, this is why fellowship is so important. This is why the local congregation is so important. So, Mike, why don't you go ahead and join Connie and Johnny so they can get a different perspective than just their spouse, okay? You have to, yes. I'm going to make Connie like you before it's over, okay? Okay. Hey, Leah, talk with Patty and John. Wow. All right, so Carrie, you and Leah talk with Patty. Okay. Come on, Dawn, don't be isolationist. Sit right there by your wife, or by your daughter, I mean. You can talk with John. We're on page 80 or 93, Dawn, in the book. Jeremy, slide down there, bud. We're doing question 1. The benefits of growing in a group instead of in isolation. Okay. So, Mac, give me one benefit of growing in a group instead of in isolation. Support. Okay, well, elaborate on that a little bit. Support in what? Okay, so someone who is there to kind of watch over, not watch over you, but be there with you and make sure that you're kind of staying on the right path and hold you accountable. Okay, somebody else. Sammy, what'd you say?
Like, if there's something that you're struggling with or don't have the answer to, someone in that group may be able to guide you in the right direction. Like, how should I disciple to this person here? Because, I don't really know how to relate to them. This person might be like, oh, hey, you can do this.
Okay, so you definitely people you can bounce ideas off of. You can look for answers. They can help you. Maybe they've learned something that you haven't, etc. Good. Okay. What about Patty?
The developing relationships, sharing.
I think you read ahead. Okay. Well, how does growing in a group obviously help develop relationships? Because they're not synonymous. They're not synonymous. But how can being in a group help develop those relationships?
By listening to others, then you can pick up on some things that they're talking about that maybe you hadn't thought of. And come closer.
Okay. Don, what'd you say? What's a benefit of growing in a group?
Well, you can bounce ideas off each other, and get different perspectives on things. Decide just what you think yourself.
Okay.
Somebody else thinks.
Absolutely. Anybody else got one we haven't said yet?
Another thing too is, I think we all have acquaintances, but growing in a group is deeper in developing that relationship because we all desire those relationships and need those relationships. And by doing that with a group, it grows deeper
Right.
versus being surface.
Let me ask y'all this, kind of flip the tables a little bit. What is one of the problems with trying to grow in isolation? What's a problem with trying to grow in isolation, trying to grow by yourself?
You don't know if you're progressing or not. I mean, you may think you are, but you may not know that.
No accountability? I don't know if y'all have ever watched the Olympics, especially the swimming, and if someone gets disqualified, or even the racing and the running during the Summer Olympics, someone gets disqualified in the heat, and there ends up being only one person left in the heat, and they have to run the heat by themselves. Why is that harder? Nobody's setting the pace with, so you really have no idea how you're doing comparatively. Not that we're comparing ourselves to others, but everybody knows as well as I do, the people beside you are pushing you to go farther, to go faster. And so being in a group absolutely helps us. Things I wrote down was perspective, whether it's a biblical perspective, a life perspective, an experiential perspective. We always learn more from others than we do from ourselves because we'll learn about ourselves from other people. And then accountability. We are called to hold each other accountable and keep us up to a holy standard. All right. So let's turn to the next page. As I was reading this last night, this really challenged me as we continue going through this. But if we would, I'm going to go ahead and read the first passage over here on the left, and I'm going to have somebody read the next two. But it says this on the left side, Mark chapter 3. This is how God is relational. So Jesus modeled for us not just how to live, not how to live perfectly, but how to live within a group, how to live within relationship. And so it says this, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to them those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, designating them apostles that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. Good morning, Joe. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. That's awesome. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Okay, would somebody read Mark 9:33 through 37 for me?
They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What are you arguing about on the road?" They kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all." He took a little child and had him stand among them. Taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me."
Okay? And somebody read Mark 10, 32 through 34. A lady. Oh, go ahead.
And Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We're going to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests, and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later he will rise."
Okay. So let me ask you this. We're going up to number 2 as we're kind of going through this. All right. How many people were in Jesus' discipleship group? 12. Okay. 12. 13 counting him. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And if you were to actually go back and look at each one of these guys too, like these were not people that were like the same economic class, the same belief system, the same, like these were guys that on the out, looking out from the outside looking in, were not going to get along. Like these weren't necessarily like your ideal candidates. But notice what it said in Mark chapter 3 at the very beginning. What does it say when he went up to the mountaintop? He called what? The ones he wanted. Okay, and that's huge. Okay, he called the ones he wanted. And there's a problem with that today. We are such a cliquish society and such a soft society, I guess you will, that if I were to say, okay, I'm going to pick 10 of you all or 12 of you all, and you are going to be in my small group for the next 3 years, and no one else can come in, okay, what would other people say? Why? Why?
Because they weren't included.
Right.
And they probably look at why they weren't included or that you didn't like them, whatever.
Favoritism, and you pick. But here's the thing: why did Jesus pick these 12? Like he knew who he wanted. He saw something in them, and wanted to invest in them. And so, but this is why small groups are so important: is that Jesus, one man, investing in 12 people for 3 years, changed the world. Changed the world. And a lot of times we have a hard time investing in 5 people for a week. And this is where we have to start trying to be more like Christ in our relationships. And that means if you pay attention, Jesus was with them everywhere. Like everywhere they went, they were together. And I know that's kind of hard to pull off in our days. I was joking with Sammy one day saying, let's just all just move into one house together and we'll just, cut off and we'll have to make as much money. And he was like, no. Okay. What about it, Mac? You up for that? We'll move in. We'll move in this week. All right. Now, let me ask you this. Why wasn't the group open to anyone who wanted to show up? Those are the ones he wanted. And just reading this now, it says he went up to the mountaintop and he called to him those he wanted, and they came to him, and he appointed 12. How does that read to you all? That there was more than 12, okay? But there was some he wanted, and so maybe he wanted them to come up there because he wanted them to hear this, okay? He wanted him to hear that there's importance in this. And so I don't know if there were more or who they were, but we know that there were people up there that maybe did not get chosen as his apostles, but we also know that there were a lot of people that he called disciples that followed him, and they still share. Like Philip was not one of the 12. Timothy was not one of the 12. Paul was one out of due season. And yet these are people who continue to share because why? Maybe they were under these apostles. Maybe they were part of their discipleship group, okay? And he sent them out. My brother used to take Aikido, which is a type of martial arts. And he was so pumped when he was a little kid because the guy that taught him Aikido had been trained by one of the 7 people who were originally trained by the guy who created it over in the Orient somewhere. And to him, that meant a lot because that meant these guys knew what they were talking about because they learned from the master. And so it was like a direct. He didn't want to have some, Jim Bob ninja star, teacher coming off the street teaching him, redneck karate, But it meant a lot to him that the person he was learning from was a direct student from those who learn from the master. And so we want to make sure that when we're following people that they know Christ, that they absolutely know their word. They're not going to be perfect, but we're going to follow them because they know it. And so this is why it's important to understand when we talk about creating a relational environment, would I love to be able to have a relationship and be close to every single person in this community? Absolutely. Can I? No. And if I try to, what's going to happen to everybody else in my life? They're going to fall by the wayside. I'm going to have no relationships, period. When we try to spread ourselves too thin, and not that I'm a great example of this, because I do this all the time, but when we spread ourselves too thin, nobody gets value from it, okay? And so at some point you have to say, okay, here's our group. This is who we're going to invest in. But here's the thing. This is why this is so great. If you invest in 12 people for a certain amount of time and they're ready to go out, and then they invest in 12 people for a certain amount of time, and then they invest in 12, all of a sudden you're contacting way more people than you ever could on your own. Way more, if you're intentional with just a few. And so we need to keep this in mind. And this is not just for myself. It's not just for the elders. It's not just for the deacons. This is what we're called to as believers. Now, your discipleship group may be one person. It may be somebody you work with. It may be somebody in your family. Okay, you might have 15 people that you meet with weekly. It's going to be different for everybody, but the same call is consistent within the body of believers. All right. Now, how did Jesus give special attention to this group in those 3 passages? How did he give them special attention? He was with them. Okay.
He entrusted them with what was going to happen.
He would let them know what was going to happen. Okay. What else? Talk to them. Right. He basically said, okay, you're the guy, you're the guy, you're the guy. What else did he do?
He did miracles in front of them, so they reinforced what he said.
Their belief. Yep. And did miracles for them. What else?
And he corrected them when they made mistakes.
Right, he corrected them. Now look at Mark 10, verse 32. Okay, there's something that's important here, because remember, in order, before you have a relational environment, you got to have a leader who's what? This was last week's. Intentional. Okay, you have to have a leader who's intentional, who knows where he's going. Remember, if you talked about last week, Jesus asked him the question. He said he only asked him just to ask him. He already knew what he was going to do. Like, Jesus was intentional. He knew how he was going to lead. And so, which, Joe, you did a great job last week, by the way. What does he do in chapter 10, verse 32? What does it say there? They were on their way up to Jerusalem with what? Jesus leading the way. Okay? And if you notice, most of the time that they were following Jesus in these 3 years of his ministry, they didn't really do much other than what he asked them to do. They didn't really take the reins themselves until when? After he died, and then what? The Holy Spirit fell on him. Okay? He said, wait, and then you'll be empowered, and then go. Okay? And so we got to make sure that we are willing to follow in order to be able to lead. All right. Now, at the bottom here, I'm going to ask you to think about this. You're not going to have to answer it right now because it'll take a little bit too much time. But this really got me. He said, are you relational as an individual? And this is not asking, are you outgoing or are you introverted? Just saying, are you relational? And that's a big difference. It says, if you're working through this, you've been meeting a small group, which is what we are here. Okay. See if you can answer the following questions about 4 people in your group without their help. Okay. Can you tell me 4 people's names, where they work, who their spouse is, what their children's names are, where they grew up, and what their favorite hobby is in this group? And your spouse doesn't count. I mean, think about that for just a minute. Because it's easy for us to say, I love my church, and I love the people in my church. And where does such and such work? I have no idea. Where do they live? I have no idea. What's their kids' names? Oh, shoot, I don't know. How much do we truly love people if we don't know anything about them? That's superficial, okay? And that's on the surface. Now, you can love people by the way they serve you, and you can love people by the way they treat you, but to actually be relational with them, it takes investment. It takes questions. It takes a trip to Waffle House at 10 at night, right, Mac? Okay? Mac and I were golden after that, okay? But I want you to think about that. Can anybody in here do that? I thought I could. I still had one blank on here. One line I did not know. Okay. What's your favorite hobby, Deidre? Maybe I'm right. I left it blank. I put that yours was spending time with family. You're welcome. Huh? Okay. But really think about this, because here's the better question is not necessarily do we know these things, but do we want to? Like that's really what it boils down to. Because obviously, just going through and taking a survey and like, okay, Kim, where'd you grow up? What's your favorite hobby? Like just so I can be like, yep, I found out. That doesn't mean I wanted to know. That doesn't mean I'm interested in her life, okay? You should want to know these things so that you know the person. Because again, if I found out what you do for a living, then I have some questions to ask you. You have resources, you have experiences that I may not have at my job, and vice versa. What's your story with your kids? Maybe you had miscarriages that no one else knew about, and that kind of gives us an idea of where you are in life. Maybe growing up was not that great for you, and that kind of helps me understand where you're coming from and where we don't know those things until we know the person. And so a lot of times we'll hear people's responses or their opinions on things, and we'll make a judgment call based on that and have no idea what led up to that point. And we need to know those things. All right, so on number 4, this is what you can do right now. Place an X on the line below representing how well you know your group on average. Don't have a clue. They're all just acquaintances. I know some about them. I know them well, their strengths and weaknesses. Some about everybody? No, that was what I checked. I put, I know some about them. I know some about them.
I feel like there ought to be a in-between, because I sort of hit the line. I think I know some, and I know some strengths, but maybe not enough to really tell the difference.
Right. Absolutely. That's right. That's right. Now, let me ask you this. King of the road? Has anybody seen the movie Christmas with the Cranks? Okay, well, in the movie, there's this guy that shows up at their Christmas party, and he knows everybody by name. And they're all like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? And, like, he looks at the priest, and he's like, do you know him? He's like, I don't know who he is. And when they find out, he's the Santa Claus that always passes out the umbrellas and all this, and he sees everybody on the street. But in the movie, he's supposed to actually be Santa. But it's important that we do know about each other, and we spend time. And here's the thing we need to clarify is that will this type of relationship happen on a Sunday morning service? No. Okay. Don't get me wrong. Sunday morning services are valuable, and it's the time to come and learn and fellowship and worship together as a body of believers. But relationship is not truly going to happen in that hour or hour and a half that you're there, depending on if I'm preaching or Sean's preaching. Okay. You need to know people, and that means it's going to happen outside of the doors, okay? That's true. I'm going to talk about that today, actually, but on a different note. But all right, go down to number 5, and we'll finish with this, okay? All right, if you were to be in a group, okay, in a small group, a little more intimate setting than this, maybe if we split this group in half and circled up, my mic just died. List 3 questions you might use to build relationships in a group. Okay, what would be 3 questions you might use to build relationships in a group? Think about that for just a second. We'll write them down, and then we're going to discuss, and we'll close up with that. So go ahead. What are 3 questions you might use to build relationships in a group? I did bring my other shoes, but I've got many compliments. Yes. Well, I was in a hurry this morning. No, they're not on the counter. Are you kidding me? No. Y'all quit telling lies on me. Zach was kind of freaked out because he was wondering where the person was that they went to. All right. Can we come up with our questions? No. Come on, Sammy. Oh, my goodness. I can't bend over. You always ask where you work? Okay, where you work. That's a good one. I got that one on here. Okay. What else? What do you enjoy doing? What are your hobbies? Okay. How long have you been a Christian? Okay. Now, that's a really interesting question when you ask them that and they're like, I'm not. It's happened, okay? You want to go to dinner? Okay, you want to go to Aldi? Yeah. Where do you live? What else? Go ahead, Patty. What was your favorite experience growing up? You read ahead. I'm just teasing. Do what? What do you do for fun? You know, I actually, you know, some of these questions still are surface level. And actually, the question that John just asked right there is when you really start to find out about people. You find out who they were as a kid, what their life was like growing up. And so when you find out those stories, you start to find out really about them, because when someone shares their favorite childhood memory, like, you start to see the real person. They start to go kind of reveal who they are. And that's really important. You know, so if you turn on the back, just in case you're not sure. Well, hello. I guess I can talk about you today. Okay. A good place to start is past, present, and future. Okay. What is your fondest childhood memory? Are you where you thought you would be 10 years ago? If you had one wish for your future, what would it be? Okay. If you had one wish for your future, what would it be? All these are great to start conversation. Okay. But the goal is to get a little deeper than just the surface. And this is why this is so important, guys, because we had a girl that went with us on our trip. Her name's Paige. She was one of our nursing students that went with us. And one of the second day, I think we were in Peru, and we were sitting down to eat. And I'm just kind of trying to figure out who our team is. So I'd already asked several of them, you know, what's your story? You know, what's your church story? And I was like, okay, so what about you? Like, what's your spiritual journey been like? Expecting to hear, well, I got saved when I was such and such. And she begins to tell me about her mother and father. Her dad was an atheist or agnostic. Her mom's Catholic, and she never really had anything growing up. And as we got to the end of the conversation, I said, so would you call yourself a Christian or someone who's searching? And she's like, someone who's searching. And I was kind of like, wow. You know, I didn't realize that we'd have non-believers on our team down there. And so we had a man share the gospel with her the second day we were down there, and I'm going to talk a little more about this today. But long story short, she gave her life to Christ while she was down there, and while we were on this trip. And this guy shared the gospel with her because his younger brother, when he was 24 and his brother was 21, was killed in a car accident. And he never shared the gospel with him as a young believer because he didn't want to push his brother away. He didn't want to make him angry. He didn't want to hurt his feelings. And so he never really shared the gospel with him. And he said, from that day forward, I made a point that I'm never going to miss an opportunity to share the gospel. And so this is why relationships are so important, is we have to break this ice, because, you know, going to the restaurant the other day, in my head, I didn't tell Leah this until yesterday, but in my head I was like, okay, I was really challenged by this guy while we were down there as to how I share my faith and talk to people about the Lord. And in my head I was like, okay, whoever our waitress is or waiter, I'm going to talk to them about the Lord. And just in the midst of our having fun and hanging out, I didn't. And then that next day she was in a really bad car accident and was in severe critical condition in the hospital. And it was just like, right there, you just don't know. And people are looking for that relationship, and we have to be the ones that are meeting their needs, meeting them, and meeting the void for them. So keep that in mind today, that we have to create this relational environment. And I want to point something out on page 93. If you look at the bottom of the page, this is huge, okay? And a lot of this is based on your leader, okay? There are numerous advantages to growing as a group. Listen to this last line, though. But if a group is not intentional about building relationships, it's just another class. And the last thing we need in church is another class. It's the last thing we need. We need to be intentional about building relationships. Okay? All right. Make sure you're continuing on through the week. I know some of you said you've been struggling with sticking with this, and that's okay. Pick it up when you can. You know, a little bit is better than none. So you still got 8 weeks left. And then soon, towards the end of this month, we're going to start talking about our mentor-mentee groups that we're going to start, right, Leah? Towards the end of this month, we're going to start talking about the mentor-mentee groups. Okay? So be ready for those. Are there any other comments, complaints, or questions, or prayer requests before we close out with a word of prayer?
We have been, sorry, boy over here.
Hi, guys. Y'all are very white.
Once she sits down, she can't get back up.
Listen,
We
that's
have started a open prayer call before we open up at 9 o'clock.
Awesome. Good for you. Opening prayer at work. That's awesome. Awesome. Right. Awesome. Anybody else? Eric has started they've started doing a prayer to open up their work day at his bank every morning before they start. So, anybody else? All hearts and minds clear? Yes? Any prayer requests at all? No? All right. Matt, can you close us out with a word of prayer?